Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to conclude our River Valley civilizations with China. China is by far the most contiguous set of historical locations we have than the rest of the world. We have the best connection from the ancient world of China to the modern day of China because it all got written down, despite dynasties like we see in Egypt, or flooding like we see in Mesopotamia or India, or even foreign invasion like we see in, all of them. China continues to record what happens, and this paints a better picture of their world than we see in any of the other four River Valley civilizations. So, let's get started. We've discussed dynasties before, and that is when a family holds power over a long period of time. In Egypt, we saw 30 dynasties. In China, this is the list. And the dynasties in China are very different than the dynasties in Egypt because we see they hearken to major characteristics and themes. And I want to share with you a little song, and this is one of the only times you'll ever hear me sing, to remember the order of the dynasties and what they do. And it goes to the tune of Frere Jacques. So if you're feeling bold or maybe excited or maybe just what the heck, well, here we go. Shang Zhou Xin Shang Zhou Xin Sui Tang Song, Yan Ming Qing Republic, Mao Zedong. If you've ever heard of a dynasty, you might know what those things are. Hopefully this is just a preview of some of the fascinating things we'll see with China, and I promise the end of my singing. In the ancient period of Chinese history, things get kind of interesting because we have heroes and legendary figures that are so fantastical but so sordid in what they will do with the rest of China's culture and kind of impact. You've got Yao, who brought harmony to society, Shun, who created seasons and weights and measures, Yu, who tamed the rivers. They're all very fantastical, but sometimes, like we've seen before, you create a god for these things. And the difference of this and other places, the Chinese just used kings to do it. The Yellow River is where we see our first peoples are going to set themselves up. It came from Tibet, and the soil was a little more loose, a little less packed, and so when it gets moving and grooving, it looks yellow. And this river was also called China's Sorrow because, like the Tigris and Euphrates, it flooded relatively uncontrollably. Sometimes it was the river of tears because of that. Rarely, but this is an interesting thing, we actually see Neolithic societies in China, and they have been relatively well preserved. The best example is Yangshao, which existed from about 5 to 3000 BCE. It's Neolithic, so they had farming and agriculture, but they were not quite a civilization yet. When we think about the River Valley civilizations, it's kind of going to be the beginning of Foundation Age as well. Because when you look at on that picture on the right and the dynasties that existed, these dynasties are going to be around for centuries, in some cases millennia. And we really can't specifically say this is River Valley time, this is Foundation, this is Classical, until we get into the end of the Zhou and Qin dynasties. But I did want to point out that all of them are in the same general location in China, and despite some expansion, they all have that same place on the Huanghe. Geographically, mountains to the west, rivers to the east, and then a giant desert. Marching across China from the Sea of China to head west, you're going to eventually get to a terrible desert that people are not going to be able to cross too easily. And the Chinese knew that there was that desert, and they didn't go past it too often. Heck, it was the Romans who come in and do a lot of trading, and even then it was thought that they were going to die. Because of the isolated nature of China's geography, they even are going to believe that the world literally revolves around them. And this ancient map of China kind of depicts this, the idea that the world is revolving around China. Early Chinese language is pictographic, then becomes iconographic, where each of the different symbols means a different idea. And despite the fact that China is going to have philosophies over religions, we do see early Chinese religions had gods based on rules of nature instead of anything else. But again, that's typical to what we see with the other river valley civilizations. That's nothing too new. The first and widely unprovable dynasty was the Zhou Dynasty. This dynasty, we're not sure it existed, because if it existed before agriculture. Not before agriculture, before the written word. That picture on the left there is what's called an oracle bone. It's done on a turtle shell, and that etching is some of the first writings we see in China. And references to Jia don't actually show up until after the Shang had already begun. The legends and heroes of China's ancient mythology, the ones who could tame rivers and tried every leaf and then invented tea, were said to come from the Zhou Dynasty. Because of its unprovability, it's kind of seen like Arthurian legend, something that would be neat if existed, but there's no proof, so, what you gonna do? The first dynasty we see in China was the Shang Dynasty, and this map really shows a very interesting thing, how big China is outlined there, and then that highlighted region where the word dynasty is, that's as big as the Shang ever got. It wasn't that big, but it did lay all the foundations China is ever going to need. We've discussed dynasties before, and that is when a family holds. While worship of gods wasn't uncommon, ancestor worship was much more prevalent. You would pray to your ancestors believing that they were going to get involved in your life. They were going to shape your world. If you were in trouble, they could help you, and they would help you as long as you kept their shrines looking good, as long as you visited their grave sites, and to further honor those that were not dead yet, the importance of filial piety, which is respect for your elders. These ideas, these topics, these concepts are going to really play heavily into China's soon to be developing philosophies, most infamously Confucianism, but we'll get to that later. The first and widely unprovable dynasty was the Zhou Dynasty. This dynasty, we're not sure it existed, because if it existed before agriculture. Not before agriculture, before the written word. That picture on the left there is what's called an oracle bone. China's big clothing impact was sericulture, the ability to cultivate silk. Now, silk comes from the webbing that worms create. And this was a highly guarded secret, because for a long time China was the only place in the world that you could get silk, and they knew this. It was such a highly guarded state secret. If you were found smuggling out the worms, there was no prison sentence, no court appearance. You were just executed. And in the West, people were so curious about what silk was when the Romans first came to China, and they knew what silk was by then. When they first came to China, they believed they were going to find silk like growing on a tree or something. And boy, were they wrong. Early political power in China, specifically in the Shang and kind of the early Zhou Dynasty, was based on the idea that the king owns the land, and the land is his. He is letting you stay there, and you are going to pay him for that luxury, whether that's payment in money or payment in military service. It really didn't matter. Because of the isolated nature of China's geography, they even are going to believe that the world literally revolves around them. And this ancient map of China kind of depicts this, the idea that the world is revolving around China. All of these river valley civilizations lived in the Bronze Age, but the government of China, the Shang Dynasty, was so dead set that bronze was something special that you had to get permission to even work with this stuff. If you are found making anything out of bronze without permission, it's an executable offense. It doesn't matter if it's a well decorated piece of art or a shovel. If you don't get government permission and all your forms checked and all your dues paid, your head's going on that chopping block. An example of something else that could be buried, a war chariot. In this case, this also has the horses. The Shang government's economy was slowly moving. They did trade, they used shells for money, but it was really peasant labor. It was serf labor. It's the kind of stuff that grows at a glacially slow level when it does. The social family units in Shang era China, and this is going to extend for our next couple of dynasties, usually were multi-generational. Dad has all the power. It is monogamous. Dad conducts the rituals, mom raises the children, and while families were monogamous, they were not always monogamous, especially for men. Women were subservient to all men in Chinese culture. Early Chinese language is pictographic, then becomes iconographic, where each of the different symbols means a different idea. And despite the fact that China is going to have philosophies over religions, we do see early Chinese religions had gods based on rules of nature instead of anything else. But again, that's typical to what we see with the other river valley civilizations. That's nothing too new. And that was the mandate of heaven. The idea of the mandate of heaven, despite the fact it has the word heaven in it, it is not especially a religious concept. The mandate of heaven says that the king should rule just so long as heaven supports the king. And if the king is ever defeated and someone deposes them, clearly heaven does not support that king. Zhou uses this justification for how he came to power, the way he came to power, and why he did what he did. And this went pretty well with the Chinese people. They accepted this as, okay, that makes sense. And for the rest of China's history, every single time we see a dynastic switch, this is the justification for it. Wu Zhao, the son of Wen, kept power. I mean, Wen did it because of military control, but Wu does it by taking all the land he has and he starts giving large chunks of it away. And I don't mean like enough for a farm, I mean enough to be like a different state. to his closest family, his military advisors, under the agreement that they would serve him in anything that needed to happen. And this is the dawn of feudalism. Wu gave land to different people. In return, they would serve the state when and how necessary. Ultimately, this would lead to the collapse of the Zhou Dynasty, but that was like almost 700 years later. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to China is the printing press. Now, the invention of the printing press allows for mass production of books, text, the written word as a whole. And the Chinese did this 7 centuries before it happened in the West. And the way this printing press worked is, well, you can see a picture of it there. You've got a large, empty, about 1 foot by 1 foot block of wood. And then you just assemble these little wooden tiles inside. And each tile has a different letter or iconographic image on it. What you do is you assemble the letters in the order you need them to. You paint the whole thing with a whole bunch of ink. You roll a piece of paper over the top of it, and then bam, instant photocopy. It is extremely simple, but it also worked. And it worked so well that China was able to produce a lot more literature than the rest of the world. In India, we saw that knowledge was passed down by one person speaking it to another person. In China, this is going to allow for so much more dissemination of knowledge. And education and learning is going to be the kind of thing that is available for everybody, not just that rich upper class. So, today we took a look at some of the origins of China, the Shang, the Zhou, and even some of the early Jia. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.